Welcome to Beer Untapped with Perry Miller, the podcast. These episodes were originally aired on Brookings Radio. Now they're on the net for you.
Hey, if you want to hear anything special on the show, reach out to us on Facebook. We're always looking for new content. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to Beer Untapped with Perry Miller. Way back on our second episode ever, we talked about the hottest style in craft beer, the IPA. It's now more than 4 years later, and it's still far and away the dominant style, but it has changed a lot. Seth Cook at With Mike's Brewing in Brookings.
IPA stands for India Pale Ale. Is what it's called. Derived the history, the story of the IPA is that it had some involvement with the colonialism of the British when they were over in India. The pale ale was sent to them, and of course it was specially brewed and specially designed to make the journey and become the pale ale to be consumed in India. Therefore, become the India Pale Ale. And that story still gets told in tap rooms.
Homebrewers in the 80s in the U.S. loved these somewhat hoppy British pale ales and began making their own versions, but with American hops. These young homebrewers began starting their own breweries, and, led by Sierra Nevada, several started making very hop-forward beers.
The homebrewers of the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, the IPA became the pinnacle for hops. And then as people loved the style, it began to branch. What started as just a modest hopped-up pale ale has now went into a dozen different categories. What was maybe grandfathered by one British style, now as we sit, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different recognized varieties by the BJCP. Again,
plus they split off double IPA, so there's at least one other one too.
Right, and this doesn't even include the classic British style IPA.
Does that include the hazies, by the way?
I don't even think that is included in the hazies. What we're looking at here is the 2015 edition, which seems like forever ago, but it's the most recent one. 2015 edition of the BJCP.
That's the Beer Judge Certification Program. It is the American craft brewers that took the IPA in all these different directions. And the rest of the world has certainly taken note. The American-style IPA is now brewed around the world. And while there are many varieties, hops rule the day with the IPA.
The hops are the stars. It doesn't necessarily have to be bitter, but a lot of traditional IPAs will have some bitterness. Will have some residual bitterness with it. But the floral aromas and the aromatics are probably the thing that you want to get the most out of the style.
More on the IPA right after this. Welcome back to Beer Untapped with Perry Miller as we revisit the IPA. Since our first show on the IPA, our second show ever, some 4 years ago, the style has changed dramatically. Back then, we were just at the end of the big and bitter trend, and it seemed like a battle over who could make the most biggest IPA. Seth Cook at With Mike's Brewing in Brookings.
Bitter IPAs, or even, especially double IPAs, at least of the time, had a very distinct bitterness. I mean, they were big and they were boozy and they're heavy, but they had a kind of almost a coy, almost a mouth puckering
almost
bitterness.
resiny.
Yeah, resiny. There's a good word for it. Having to wash your tongue after you drink them type of bitterness. That you can still get some of those. Not as prevalent.
Even 4 years ago, it was starting to change, especially on the East Coast. Both East and West Coast IPAs had started to place greater importance on aroma and juicy, fruity hops. Dry hopping was gaining prominence.
Hops are usually added to give the aromatics. After the beer has been boiled and fermented, it's added later.
They call it dry hopping.
Dry hopping. So what you're doing is you're soaking these hop plants, soaking these flowers to extract those aromatics, to extract those flavors without boiling them to give them any of the bitterness.
The trend toward juicy and fruity was taken to a new extreme in the Northeast, where the hazy or Northeast-style IPA was born. That style is all about citrus and tropical fruit flavors, aromas, very little bitterness. They're also, as you might guess, extremely cloudy, even turbid. Not exactly pretty.
That's been an East Coast experiment that has taken over the nation in general, and that's it's an interesting category because they're even in the brewing community. There's been a debate on whether a beer should have that amount of turbidity and that amount of haze, and there's some people that don't like it. Some people that say that's the only way to get the real hop or hop flavor and juiciness out of it. I think if you like that beer, then that's the way you drink it. I don't think I'm going to get too caught up in it. I'm not as personally, I'm not as big a fan that they're good. But I would prefer the American Pale Ale, the more traditional IPA styles over some of the New England ones. But don't get me wrong, I still enjoy. I mean, that's the nice thing about beer these days, and especially the IPAs. We have a whole selection we can pick from. There is no one way to do it.
That's it for this week's show. Until next time, drink local and drink responsibly. Thank you for listening to Beer Untapped with Perry Miller, originally aired on Brookings radio stations K-Country 102.3, The Hawk 107.1, and B93, and now here for your listening enjoyment as well. If you want to hear it live, it's every Wednesday and Saturday on those 3 stations.
And of course, if you're not in the Brookings area to hear it live, you can find us on the internet on your favorite podcast player. If you like this show, make sure to rate and review, or maybe even tell your friends.